3 years after Pearl Harbor, on a black night in October of 1944, 5 American battleships that the Japanese had sunk or crippled in that harbor came back for their revenge. They found it in a narrow strait in the Philippines. They found it in about 7 minutes. And when it was over, a Japanese battleship called Fuso was gone, rolled over onto her back in the dark, sunk in her own burning oil. Nearly 1,800 of her men were dead in the water around her or trapped inside her hull. Most of them were boys, 18, 19, 20, farm kids from the Japanese countryside, fishermen's sons from small towns along the inland sea. They died in the dark in a fight their own admiral never fully understood was happening. Because here's the thing about the 7 minutes it took to break Fuso. She never saw the ships that were killing her. Her lookout stared into the blackness and saw nothing. Her admiral on the flagship a few miles ahead of her did not even know she was already dying. He was still sending her orders when she was already gone. This is the story of those 7 minutes, as much of it as the sea gave back. Because there is one more thing you have to know before we start. Almost no one on Fuso came home to tell it. What we know from the men on the American side who killed her, from radar plots, from radio traffic, from 10 Japanese survivors who lived, and from the wreck itself, still down there on the floor of the Surigao Strait, lying upside down in 185 meters of black water, waiting. We have to begin with the man who was leading her to her death. Not the captain of Fuso. His name we know, but almost nothing else. The man in command of the whole force was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, 55 years old that autumn, a career Navy man out of Iwo Jima, the Japanese Naval Academy on its small green island in the inland sea. He had been going to sea since he was a boy. He had commanded destroyers in the very first days of the Pacific War 3 years earlier in the swift Japanese invasion of the Philippines. He had commanded cruisers through the long, grinding nightmare of Guadalcanal in 1942, where the American and Japanese navies had bled each other in the dark month after month. He had a reputation among his own officers as a plain man, a sea officer, not brilliant, not showy, steady, the kind you wanted beside you in a bad night. Something was different about him now in the autumn of 1944. Something the men around him could see but did not always speak of aloud. A few years earlier, his son had been killed. Teiji Nishimura, a naval aviator, his only son, killed in the very campaign in the Philippines the father had helped to fight. And now in October of 44, Shoji Nishimura had been given command of Battleship Division 2 in order to take that division back to the Philippines into a battle every senior officer in the combined fleet understood was very close to hopeless. He was going to sail into the same waters where his boy had died. He never said what he thought about that. Perhaps he did not have to. Battleship Division 2. That autumn was the Fuso and her sister, the Yamashiro. They were old ships. They were in some ways sad ships. Fuso had slid down the launching ways at the Kur Naval Arsenal in March of 1914, in the months before Europe would drift into the First World War. She had been at that moment one of the proudest things the Empire of Japan had ever built. She was one of the first battleships in the world designed and built by Japanese engineers with Japanese engines and Japanese-made 14-inch guns. She was quite literally a statement that Japan had joined the club of nations that built dreadnoughts, a statement that the sea was theirs too. 30 years is a long time for any warship. In those 30 years, the world had learned to build faster battleships and better ones, and eventually the great monsters like Yamato that made everything else look small. Fuso had been modernized, rebuilt, given new engines, given a new fire control tower that grew upward in strange stacked tiers like a pagoda, until the officers of the Imperial Navy began to make quiet jokes that Fuso and Yamashiro were the ugliest ships in the fleet. She was 30 years old. She had 12 14-inch guns she had never once fired at an enemy, and she was steaming towards 6 American ships that had spent 3 years waiting for revenge. On the afternoon of October 24th, as she came up through the Sulu Sea toward the Strait, an American carrier plane from the USS Enterprise dove on Fuso and put a bomb into her. The damage was slight. Some fires quickly controlled. A few men killed. The old battleship kept her place in the column and steamed on. Word went through the ship that they had come through the worst of it now, that the Americans had thrown their airstrike and it had failed, and the rest of the run would be by night and the darkness would protect them. This was a lie. It was not a deliberate lie. It was the kind of hopeful lie sailors tell each other on a warship at war. But it was a lie all the same. The worst of it was not behind them. The worst of it was still hours away, waiting in the black water at the top of the strait. There were roughly 1,800 men on Fuso that night. Most were very young, ratings and seamen in their late teens and early 20s. Boys who had grown up in Japanese fishing villages and farm towns and small industrial cities. Boys who had trained on this old ship on her 14-inch guns, on her boilers, on her rangefinders, and who had most of them never seen a shot fired in anger from her. In a few hours, nearly every one of them would be dead. This is not a story where that fact is hidden until the end for effect. There is no point in hiding it. Of the 1,800, only 10 would come home to Japan. At the top of the strait waiting for them was a man who had made his life's work out of arithmetic. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, 57 years old, American, a gunnery officer to the bone. His command that night was the fire support force of the American 7th Fleet, and it was on paper one of the most powerful surface forces ever assembled in the Pacific. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, 39 PT boats, and Oldendorf had done something with those ships that admirals had been dreaming of for 400 years. He had lined them up, straight across the northern mouth of the strait, one long patient row of heavy ships, so that when the enemy came up through the narrow water from the south, they would have to steam directly toward the American line bow on. Only their forward guns could fire. All of Oldendorf's guns could answer. There is a name for this. Every naval officer in the world knows it. Every one of them in his private heart has dreamed of pulling it off once. It is called crossing the T. It is the perfect trap. It had been the perfect trap since the age of sail. It had almost never happened in the age of the battleship because it required an enemy who would obligingly steam straight into it. And now at last, in the black hours before dawn, on October 25th, an enemy was going to. And there is one more thing about the American line waiting up there in the dark. One more thing that a Japanese sailor, if he had known, would have found almost unbearable to think about. The names of Oldendorf's 6 battleships were Mississippi, Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. 5 of those 6 ships had been at Pearl Harbor on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. 5 of them had been bombed and torpedoed and set on fire, and had settled into the mud of the harbor while Japanese aircraft roared overhead. West Virginia had sunk at her mooring. California had sunk at her mooring. Pennsylvania had been hit in dry dock. Maryland and Tennessee had been damaged trapped by burning ships alongside. Every one of them had been raised or repaired or rebuilt and sent back to sea. Every one of them had spent the last 3 years crawling westward across the Pacific one island at a time, waiting for a night like this. Now in the darkness of the Surigao Strait, all 5 of them were lying in wait for a Japanese battleship together in one line. Their guns were loaded, their radars were on. They had been waiting 3 years for this. And Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, a grieving father in an old flagship, was steaming his division straight into them at 18 knots in radio silence with no clear picture of where the American fleet even was. He did not know about the trap. He did not know about the 6 battleships. He did not know that the ghosts of Pearl Harbor were waiting for him at the top of the strait. He was about to find out. The first thing you have to understand about the night of October 24th, 1944, is how dark it was. There was no moon over the Surigao Strait. There were low clouds and scattered rain, and the water was black in a way that men who have spent their lives near cities do not really know. When you stood on the bridge of a ship in that strait and you looked out over the bow, you could not see the bow. You could not see the water. You could not see your own hand in front of your face. You navigated by instrument. You held course by compass. And if you were a Japanese sailor that night, you fought the way sailors had fought for 400 years, with your eyes. And what your eyes could not find, you could not kill. The Americans had something else. Deep inside 3 of Oldendorf's 6 battleships, the West Virginia, the California, and the Tennessee, in steel rooms lit only by the soft green glow of instruments, there was a machine. It was called the Mark 8 Fire Control Radar. It was not much to look at. Cables and cabinets and a screen the size of a dinner plate. But it did something no human being could do. It reached out into the total blackness of the strait, tens of thousands of yards ahead of the ship, and it painted the enemy. It did not need light. It did not need a horizon. It did not care about the rain. It fed its numbers down into another machine, a mechanical computer the size of a large desk, and that machine solved the geometry of murder. Range, bearing, speed, course. It ground out a firing solution second by second, and it told the great 14 and 16-inch guns of the American battle line exactly where to throw a shell so that the shell and the enemy ship would arrive at the same patch of ocean at the same moment, in the dark, blindly, from miles away. The other three battleships, Mississippi and Maryland and Pennsylvania, carried older Mark III sets. They could see, but not as clearly, not as sure. That difference would matter later in a way none of them expected yet. The Japanese had nothing like it. Not on Fuso, not on Yamashiro, not on any ship in Nishimura's column. They had optics, fine German-style rangefinders, and in daylight or under a good moon, those optics were as good as anything in the world. Japanese lookouts were legendary. They trained their eyes for years. They could pick a warship out of a starlit horizon at distances Americans could barely believe. And by night, in the confused, close knife fight kind of battles the Japanese had spent the last 2 years winning off Guadalcanal, that discipline of the human eye had made them the finest night fighters on Earth. But you cannot see through a moonless overcast. You cannot see through rain. And you cannot see a battleship 22,000 yards away in a strait choked with darkness. No man alive could do that. It did not matter how well he had been trained. It did not matter how brave he was. Physics did not care. That was the fight Nishimura was steaming into. He did not know it. And even if someone had told him, he would not have believed it. Because no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy in October of 1944 really believed the Americans had solved night combat. It had been the Japanese specialty for so long that the idea of it belonging to someone else was almost unthinkable. It was the last thing they still owned. At 20 minutes past 8 in the evening on the 24th, from the flag bridge of the Yamashiro, Nishimura sent a signal to his superior Kurita and to Shima, who was following 40 kilometers behind him. The signal set the plan. His force would enter Leyte Gulf at 4 in the morning. 4 o'clock on the button. No changes. No requests for coordination. No delay to let Shima catch up. No pause to consult with Kurita, whose center force had been savaged by American aircraft that same day in the Sibuyan Sea and was in no condition to arrive on time. Nishimura did not wait for any answer. He did not know that Kurita would be late. He did not know that Shima would be too far behind to matter. He was going to hit the beach at 4. He was going alone. He was going on schedule. He was going in effect exactly the way an American planner would have hoped an enemy admiral might come. There is no way now to know why he did that. No diary, no last letter home from Nishimura himself that speaks to it. We can only guess. Perhaps he was consumed by the memory of his dead son. Perhaps he simply believed his orders and did not think it was his place to change them. Perhaps he had made his peace with dying and did not want to draw it out. Perhaps it was all three. Perhaps it was none. What we can say for certain is only what he did. He set a course. He set a time. And he did not deviate from either. Around 10:30 at night, the first American ships found him. They were not battleships. They were not cruisers. They were plywood-hulled motor torpedo boats 78 feet long, with 2 officers and a dozen enlisted men aboard, each packed into a hull that could barely stop a rifle bullet. There were 39 of them scattered up and down the strait. And when PT-131 raised the Japanese column on her radar and radioed the contact to Oldendorf, it began. For the next 3 hours, in wave after wave, the PT boats came at Nishimura's ships out of the darkness. Small, fast, low in the water. Screaming across the swells at 40 knots, launching torpedoes wheeling away. Being fired on in return by 5-inch guns and searchlights. None of their torpedoes hit. Not one. In 3 hours of attacks and something like 13 separate engagements, the PT boats put nothing into any Japanese hull. 10 of them were damaged. One of them, PT-493, took a shell and grounded on a reef and was later lost. 3 American sailors were killed. On the tally sheet, if you kept score by torpedoes, the PT boats had done nothing at all. 3 hours, 39 boats, not a single hit. And yet the trap was closing. They had done something else, something worth more than any torpedo. Every time they made contact, every time they saw the ships, Every time Nishimura turned to comb their tracks or opened up on them with his secondary guns, they radioed back the position, the course, the speed. Minute by minute, hour by hour, they drew a line on a chart for Oldendorf. They told him exactly where the enemy was and how fast he was coming and when he would arrive at the top of the strait. Nishimura, in his stubborn straight-ahead run for the beach, was drawing his own map for the men who were going to kill him. Every course change he made in the light of his own guns and small American boats out in the black, wrote it all down. Aboard Fuso, the men had been at battle stations for hours, 5 hours, some of them longer. In the great turrets, gun crews stood at their loading gear in the heat, sweating in their coveralls. In the powder magazines deep below the waterline ratings, sat in dim red light among the racked canisters of propellant. Each canister was enough to kill everyone in the room. A single hit in the wrong place, and the compartment would go up in one sudden flash. There would be no time to run. There would be no time even to know what had happened. The men in those magazines understood this. They had understood it since they came aboard. It was the price of serving in the belly of a battleship. In the boiler room, stokers watched the pressure gauges. On the bridge, officers stared into their binoculars and saw nothing. Just black. Just black and the occasional white flash off in the distance, where a PT boat had gone in against one of the destroyers ahead. They were tired, they were afraid, and their war was almost entirely silent. That is the strangest thing about being on a ship steaming toward a battle at night. There is very little to do. There is nothing to see. You stand at your station, and the ship moves under you, and the hours pass. You think about your mother. You think about a girl. You think about the meal you had before you went to sea. And you wait for something you cannot yet imagine to come out of the dark and end you. At 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, the destroyers came. They came in 3 sections. The first was under Captain Jesse Coward, the commander of Destroyer Squadron 54. Coward was a plain-spoken officer with a face that had already been in this war too long. 2 years earlier, in November of 1942, he had been in the water off Guadalcanal after his own ship, the Strait, had taken a beating in the first night battle there. He had watched American cruisers burn. He had lost friends. It was the same slot of the same ocean where the light cruiser Juno had gone down that same week with the 5 Sullivan brothers aboard her. Coward had lived through the kind of night fight the Japanese used to win. Now he was about to be one of the men who ended those nights for good. He had 3 ships with him: USS Ramey, USS McGowan, USS Melvin. They came down the strait at 30 knots, throwing white water off their bows, black shapes against a black sea, and their radars found Nishimura's column at 20,000 yards. They kept coming. At about 8,000 yards from the enemy, they fired their torpedoes. Full spreads, all at once. And then they turned hard and ran, because a destroyer that stays too close to a battleship for too long does not come home. At about 9 minutes past 3 in the morning, one of those torpedoes launched from USS Melvin ran up out of the black water and hit Fuso amidships on the starboard side. That was the moment. That was the beginning of her end. The torpedo tore into the fuel bunkers along her side. Oil spilled out into the sea, and the oil caught fire and the fire spread. She lost speed. She began to fall behind the column. Nishimura, up ahead on Yamashiro, kept steaming north unaware. Fuso could not keep up with him. She sagged out of line. She was still afloat. She was still for a few minutes more, trying to fight. But the flooding was beyond her. Water poured into her ruined bunkers and into the compartments beyond them, and she began slowly to list. For years after the war, the American reports of that night said something else. They said Fuso had broken in 2. They said the explosion inside her had cut her clean in half, and that both halves had floated for an hour burning in the strait. It was a story that everyone repeated. It was in the histories. It was in the memoirs. It was in every account you could find. It was almost the most famous thing anyone remembered about Fuso. It was wrong. We know this now because divers went down and looked. In November of 2017, a research vessel called Petrel, funded by the American billionaire Paul Allen, sent an ROV down to the floor of the Surigao Strait. And they found Fuso. She was upside down in 185 meters of black water, and she was in one piece. Her hull was cracked amidships, but that was from her hitting the seabed when she went down. Her pagoda mast had torn away as she sank and lay a short distance from the wreck. But she had not broken in 2 on the surface. She had not floated in halves. She had rolled over. and she had gone down whole into the dark. What the men on Fuso lived through in those 40 minutes after the Melvin's torpedo hit was worse than the myth. The myth is quick. A single great explosion, a ship torn in half an end. The reality was slower. She burned, she flooded, she listed. Fires spread through the length of her upper decks. Men fought them and could not stop them. The list grew. The pumps could not keep up with the water pouring in. Men in her lower compartments felt the deck rolling under them and knew with the flat certainty of sailors what was happening. Some of them tried to get up. Some of them could not. And around 3:50 in the morning, roughly 40 minutes after the torpedo strike, the old battleship rolled the rest of the way over. She turned turtle in the black water, and she sank. Roughly 1,800 men went down with her. 10 of them in the end would live to see Japan again. The second American destroyer section under Captain Kenmore McMains was still coming in behind Coward, and on the Japanese side of the ledger, the horror was not finished. USS McDermott, one of McManus's ships, fired her torpedoes and made what the United States Navy will tell you to this day is the most successful torpedo spread ever launched by an American destroyer in the history of the service. 5 torpedoes, 3 hits all on different ships. The Japanese destroyer Yamagumo blew up and sank. The destroyer Michishio was left dead in the water, her engines gone. The destroyer Asagumo had her bow blown clean off back to the anchor chain. In the space of about a minute, McDermott alone had gutted the destroyer screen of the entire Japanese force. And here is the piece of the night that is almost too painful to say out loud. At 3:30 in the morning aboard the Yamashiro, Nishimura sent a signal north to Kurita and to Shima behind him. It was a status report. It was in the manner of Japanese naval communications, brief and professional and calm. It said enemy torpedo boats and destroyers on both sides of the northern entrance to Surigao Strait. It said 2 of our destroyers torpedoed and drifting. It said Yamashiro hit by 1 torpedo but fit for battle. It did not mention Fuso, not because Nishimura was hiding anything, because he did not know. Fuso had fallen behind him in the darkness. Fuso was burning behind him in the darkness. Fuso was slowly rolling onto her back behind him in the darkness. And Nishimura, on the bridge of his flagship, driving north toward the American line, at whatever speed his damaged battleship could still make, did not know that his second battleship was dying. That 1,800 of his men were already in the water or already trapped in her hull. A little later, at about 10:04, Nishimura sent another signal. This one was addressed by name to Fuso. It ordered Fuso to increase to maximum speed and rejoin the flagship. It asked Fuso to come up to him, to close the gap, to be at his side when he entered the Gulf. The signal went out over the radio. It went out into the darkness. It reached presumably no one at all. Because the ship it was addressed to was already at the bottom of the strait or on her way there. A man was ordering a dead ship to come and fight beside him. And he did not know he was doing it. And no one who received the signal could tell him he was doing it. And the war moved on. He was talking to a ghost, and the ghost could not answer. At about 10 minutes to 4, the American battleships opened fire. The USS West Virginia had been tracking Yamashiro on her radar for minutes. Her Mark 8 computer had a firing solution. Her guns were loaded. The range was 22,800 yards, almost 13 miles. And in the dark, 13 miles from her target, with nothing to see but green marks on a screen, she fired her first salvo of 16-inch shells. 8 of them. Each one weighed as much as a small automobile. And the first salvo landed on Yamashiro. The first one. At 3 minutes to 4, USS California and USS Tennessee joined in. Then Maryland. Then a single delayed salvo from Mississippi. Pennsylvania, whose older radar could not resolve a target well enough to shoot, never fired her main guns at all that night. She sat in the American battle line and watched. The last time the great battleships of the world would fight each other in a fleet action, and one of the 6 American capital ships in the fight could not even find the enemy well enough to pull her triggers. That is what the age had come to. The 3 battleships with Mark 8 radar carried the killing. Over the whole engagement, West Virginia would fire 93 armor-piercing 16-inch shells. Tennessee would fire 69 14-inch rounds. California, 63. And Yamashiro and Megami behind her were struck by shell after shell after shell out of the darkness. Nishimura could not really answer. His optics could not find the American line at that range in that blackness. He was firing back, but he was firing at flashes, at guesses, at the memory of where a gun had spoken a minute before. His shells fell short or wide or into nothing. On the American ships, men in the plotting rooms watched the little marks on the screen shudder under each salvo and did their arithmetic and gave the guns the next set of numbers. Yamashiro burned. She lost speed. Her steering went. She began to list. At 19 minutes past 4 in the morning, she rolled over onto her side and sank. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura went down with her. So did the captain of the ship. So did nearly all 1,636 men aboard. 10 of them in the end would make it home to Japan. 10. And now the last piece. At 25 minutes past 4, Vice Admiral Kyohide Shima, coming up the strait from the south, with the 2nd Japanese force entered the same waters where Nishimura had just died. It was still dark. It was still full of smoke and burning oil and shell splashes. And Shima saw out ahead of him on the water great burning shapes drifting on the sea. Massive fires. He assumed, as any admiral would have assumed, that he was looking at the sunken hulks of both Japanese battleships. Fuso, Yamashiro, both of them gone, both of them burning. He was right about one thing. He was looking at what was left of Fuso. The fuel from her ruptured bunkers was still burning on the surface, spread out over a huge stretch of black water mixed with the wreckage of her upper works and the debris of the destroyers McDermott had killed nearby. From a distance in the dark, it looked like a graveyard of ships. It looked like the end of a fleet. That is what convinced him. That is what turned him around. He saw enough. He ordered his force to turn. In the confusion of that turn, his flagship Nachi collided with the crippled Mogami and damaged her further. But Shima kept going. He got out. He would live. He would be one of the last Japanese admirals to see the Surigao Strait and come home. Behind him on the water, the fires from Fuso kept burning, and underneath them on the bottom was Fuso herself, and roughly 1,800 men. There is a temptation when you tell a story like this to slow down at that moment and describe the last men on the deck, to put them in the shot, to imagine what they said to each other in the last seconds before the ship rolled under. It is a temptation you have to resist, because we do not know. We do not know a single name of a single sailor who was standing on the deck of the Fuso in her final minutes. We do not know if anyone was still up there at all, or if the fires had already driven every living man over the side by then. We do not know if the officers tried to organize an abandoned ship, or if they simply stood at their posts until the deck rolled out from under them. We do not know what they said. We do not know what they thought. 1,800 names, only 10 of them ever came home. The sea took the rest. Of the 7 ships that had steamed with Nishimura into the Surigao Strait that night, 1 made it out. 1. Her name was Shigure. She was a destroyer. Her captain was a man named Shigure Nishino. When the American battle line opened up and Yamashiro began to burn, and Mogami staggered off with her superstructure crushed, Shigure lost her steering for a moment and drifted in the dark, and by some chance, by some grace of geometry and current, she was not seen well enough to be finished off. She got her steering back. She turned. She ran south out of the strait, back the way she had come, past the burning oil of the Fuso, past the ruined Mogami, past the sinking hulks of Yamagumo and Michishio, and Asagumo, past all of it, and into the dawn. Nishino on her bridge was the only Japanese officer of Force C to survive the night. He would go back to Japan. He would report. He would spend the rest of his life carrying what he had seen. And what he had seen in the end was almost nothing. He had seen flashes. He had seen his own ships explode. He had seen the black water light up around him with shell splashes he could not answer. He had run and he had lived, and everything else that he might have told us about the Fuso, he did not know either. If you count them all, the numbers do not really help. Fuso, roughly 1,800, dead 10 survivors home. Yamashiro, more than 1,600 dead 10 survivors home. 20 men out of nearly 3,500. That was what the war left of Battleship Division 2. Almost 80 years later, on the 25th of November 2017, the Petrel completed its survey of the strait. Along with Fuso, the ROV found Yamashiro nearby. She too was upside down in almost the same condition. The 2 sisters that had died on the same night within a few miles of each other, victims of the same enemy, now lay on the bottom of the same strait. Together, in the dark, where they belonged. There is one more thing to say about that night, and it is not a Japanese thing. It is an older thing. Somewhere near the end of the battle, as the American line ceased fire, and the surviving Japanese ships pulled away, and the sun began to hint at itself in the eastern sky. The USS Mississippi, an old battleship of the American Pacific Fleet, put one full broadside out into the dark toward the retreating Mogami. It was too late. It hit nothing. Mississippi was firing at ghosts. She had come 3 years across the Pacific to get to this night, and she got her one shot off at the enemy, and it fell in empty water, and she stopped shooting, and she reloaded, and she waited. She never fired her main guns at another battleship again. Neither did any other ship. Not hers, not anyone's, not ever. That broadside from Mississippi into the empty dark at the north end of Surigao Strait was the last salvo ever fired from a battleship at another battleship in the entire history of the human race. For 400 years, from the age of Nelson to the age of Jutland to the killing nights off Guadalcanal, the great capital ships had traded broadsides across salt water, and it ended quietly in the last minutes of a fight that had already been decided. The American naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that in the silence after Oldendorf's guns, you could almost hear the ghosts of every admiral who had ever fought a fleet action standing at attention, saluting, because a form of war that had run for centuries had just died in front of them. The men on Fuso did not know that either. They did not know that they were the last of anything. They did not know that they were dying at the closing of an age. They were just cold and wet and burned and afraid, and then they were gone. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura went down with Yamashiro at 19 minutes past 4 in the morning. He was 55 years old. His son Teiji had died as a naval aviator in the Philippines a few years earlier. Now the father had died in the Philippines too, in the same waters, under the same stars. Both of them killed by the war they served. Neither of them buried, neither of them found. Whatever letters he had written home, whatever last thought he had on the bridge, as the American shells came down, went into the strait with him. He did not leave a note. He did not need to. He had already told the story with his ship's heading. He had steered north. He had steered straight. He had not turned. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over by 5 in the morning. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history, would run for another full day in other waters off other islands. Off Samar to the east, American escort carriers and destroyers would fight a Japanese battleship force that had come at them out of the dawn, and by their courage would drive that force back too. Off Cape Engano, American carrier aircraft would sink the last of the Japanese fleet carriers. By the time it was done, the Imperial Japanese Navy would effectively cease to exist as an offensive force. There would be a few more battles. There would be more sinkings. There would be the last awful days of the kamikaze. But as a fleet in any real sense of the word, it was finished. It had died at Leyte Gulf, and Surigao Strait was where the dying started. None of that would have mattered to a young sailor in the fire room of the Fuso. None of it would have reached him. He would have known only that he had been at his station for hours, and that the ship had lurched under his feet, and that steam had come screaming out of a broken line somewhere, and that he had climbed toward a ladder in the dark, and that the ladder was gone. That is what the end of an age looked like from the inside. It looked like a boy in a burning steel room and no one coming for him. They never saw who killed them. That is the truth of the title. It is not a metaphor. On board the Fuso, they never saw who killed them because there was nothing to see. The ship that fired the torpedo that started their end was over 4 miles away in the dark. She fired and she turned and she ran. The battleships that finished off Yamashiro fired from a blackness their optics could not pierce. The men on the Japanese ship saw flashes on the horizon and understood with the last clarity of dying men that they had been beaten by something they could not answer. Not by better sailors, not by braver men, by arithmetic, by a machine in a steel room that did not need eyes. That is what killed them, and that is what they never saw. If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather stood a watch on one of Oldendorf's battleships on Mississippi or Maryland or West Virginia or Tennessee or California or Pennsylvania, if he was on one of the cruisers or on the destroyers that went in first with their torpedoes on Ramey or McGowan or Melvin or McDermott, or on one of the plywood PT boats out in the Strait, in the dark, leave his name and his ship in the comments below this video. We read every one. Those are the men who won that night. Those are the men whose sons and grandsons are watching this now. They earned that. And on the other side of it, in the black water south of Leyte, Upside down in 185 meters of dark is Fuso, 1,800 men on her, 1,600 more on Yamashiro nearby. Boys, most of them, from fishing villages and farm towns, fighting for an empire that would not outlive them by a year. They did not choose that war. They did not choose that night. They stood their watches and they went down with their ship, and only 10 of them from each battleship ever came home to tell us their names. The sea has the rest of them now, and it will keep them.